On a spring morning in 1913, a new building opened its doors at Johns Hopkins in Baltimore. Carved into the stone above the entrance was a single word, a family name. Inside was the first academic department of psychiatry in America, a place built to study and to steady the troubled mind. The name over the door was Phipps. I have come back to that carved name more often than I can explain, because the man who put it there had started with almost nothing. He left school at 14 to apprentice in a jeweler's shop, and he became the second largest owner of the largest steel company on earth. He gave most of what he earned away, quietly, and the largest single mark he chose to leave on the world was that building, a house meant to reach the kind of suffering that money usually cannot. He could not have known that the same kind of suffering would one day come for his own blood. He left school at 14 and became the second largest owner of the largest steel company in the world. When that company was sold, in 1901, he walked away with somewhere between $40 and $50 million in gold bonds and gave the newspapers a single sentence about it. He put his family name on the first academic department of psychiatry in America, the place that effectively invented the modern psychiatric case history. The family office he built to guard the money still exists, and today it watches over more than $200 billion. His family once owned close to a third of the town of Palm Beach. A woman who married into the family quietly paid for Amelia Earhart's first flight across the Atlantic. A great-grandson of the man who built America's first psychiatric clinic died at 30 in a Manhattan hotel room of a narcotics overdose, after years inside the drug circle around the writer William Burroughs. And there is a story, passed down in the family, that the same young man was lobotomized. Not once, twice. It is the single claim in all of this that no record I could find will confirm. Most of those things are in the public record, in company ledgers and hospital archives and old newspapers. The last one is not. The distance between what can be proven and what cannot is the reason this story has to be told carefully. This is the story of how the quietest man in the Carnegie Empire turned a steel fortune into the first home of modern American psychiatry. It is also the story of a great-grandson who died at 30 inside the century of treatment that money helped build, and of a thing said about how he was treated that no record will confirm. I want to start at the building itself, with the name in the stone, because the name is the promise, and the promise is where the distance begins. Before we go on, one quick thing. If you subscribe, it helps build a community around these, and rewards the work that goes into them, and it is free. Chapter 1. The Name Over the Door. There is a particular kind of confidence in carving your own name above the door of a hospital. Not a wing, not a plaque in a corridor, but the whole building, the thing itself, named for your family and meant to outlast you. In Baltimore, on the campus of Johns Hopkins, that is exactly what happened. The building that opened in 1913 was the Harry Phipps Psychiatric Clinic, and it was the first place of its kind in the country. To understand why that matters, you have to remember what American psychiatry was before it. For most of the 19th century, the treatment of the mentally ill in the United States happened almost entirely in asylums, large institutions on the edges of cities and towns, where people were housed more than they were treated. There was no serious academic study of the mind inside the country's great medical schools. There was custody, and there was confinement, and there was not much else. The endowment for the clinic was announced in 1908, and the building itself opened 5 years later, in 1913. It was meant to change all of that. It brought the study of mental illness inside a teaching hospital, alongside surgery and internal medicine, in a university that was then remaking American medicine in its own image. It treated the mind as something a doctor could examine, record, and try to understand, rather than simply lock away. The idea now sounds obvious. At the time, it was close to radical. The notion that a state of mind belonged in a research hospital at all. For most of the 19th century, the alternative had been the asylum, where a difficult or suffering person was sent to be kept rather than cured, often for life, often forgotten. The Phipps Clinic proposed something else. The man hired to lead it, a Swiss-trained physician, built his whole method around listening. He took down each patient's life in detail, the family, the work, the disappointments, the long, slow accumulation of a person, and he called the result a history. That method, the careful written life of the patient, became known in the field as the Phipps history, and a version of it is still taught at Johns Hopkins today. So the family did something genuinely lasting. They did not just fund a building. They helped invent the way an entire country would come to think about the troubled mind. The idea that a person in distress had a story worth taking down, worth reading, worth treating with patience. The doctors trained in that building carried the method out across the country, into other hospitals and other departments, until a way of thinking that began with one family's money became simply the way American medicine approached the mind. That is about as large a mark as private wealth can leave. Most fortunes buy a name on a wall. This one bought a method that outlived everyone who paid for it. I find I cannot walk past that idea quickly. A Steele family, whose fortune came out of the loudest and most violent industry of its age, paid to build the quietest room in American medicine, the room where someone finally sat down and asked a suffering person to talk. It is a beautiful thing to have done. It is also, knowing what came later, almost unbearably ironic, and I want to be careful not to flatten either half of that into the other. Because the promise carved over that door was a promise about suffering. It said, in effect, that this family believed the mind could be cared for, that distress was not a thing to be hidden, but a thing to be understood, that a person coming apart deserved a doctor and a record and a chance. The family kept that promise for strangers, thousands of them, for more than a century. Patients who never knew the name in the stone were treated under it, listened to under it, written down under it, generation after generation. What it could do for one of its own is the harder question, and it is the one this whole story is circling. The name in the stone is the beginning of it. The man who earned the right to put it there is the next part, and he came from about as far from a hospital wall full of his own name as a person could start. He came from a row house in Pittsburgh, 2 doors down from the boy who would become Andrew Carnegie. Chapter 2. 2 doors down, Henry Phipps, Jr. was born in Philadelphia in 1839, the son of an English immigrant shoemaker, into the kind of family that measured money in coins rather than in figures on a page. His father had crossed the Atlantic with a trade and not much else, and he raised his children to expect work rather than inheritance. There was no cushion under them. Whatever any of them became, they would have to build from the ground. When he was a boy, the family moved west to Pittsburgh, to a working district called Allegheny City, and they took a small house on Rebecca Avenue. 2 doors down, at number 336, lived another immigrant family of modest means, the Carnegies, recently arrived from Scotland. The 2 boys, Henry Phipps and Andrew Carnegie, grew up almost on top of each other, in the smoke of a city that was becoming the iron capital of the country. Neither of them had anything. Both of them would die among the richest men in American history. Phipps left school at 14. There was no money for more of it, and so he went to work, first as an errand boy and then as an apprentice in a jeweler's shop, where he earned $1.25 a week. The detail that survives about him from this period is small and telling. As a teenager, with no money behind him, he once borrowed 25 cents from his brother to place a want ad of his own in a Pittsburgh newspaper, offering himself up for better work. That is the scale we are starting at. A borrowed quarter, a single line of newsprint, a boy looking for any way up. Neither his family nor the Carnegies down the street had servants or savings or a name that meant anything. Whatever distance these boys traveled, They would travel it from a standing start, on a street where nobody expected either of them to amount to much. What Phipps had was not the showman's flair that Carnegie had. It was something quieter and, finally, just as valuable. He had a head for figures, for accounts, for the unglamorous arithmetic of whether a business was actually making money or only appeared to be. He learned bookkeeping in a local academy, the practical kind of schooling a poor and clever boy could still get his hands on. He learned how credit worked, how to keep a firm solvent through the lean months, how to read a ledger and see the truth in it when the men running the business preferred a more flattering story. In a young industrial economy, where a great many men could dream and very few could actually count, that was close to a superpower. The dreamers needed someone who could tell them whether the dream was solvent. Phipps could. In 1872, he married Anne Childs Schaefer, the daughter of a Pittsburgh manufacturer, and the marriage lasted 58 years, until his death. They would have 5 children, and it is those children and their children who carry the rest of this story. But all of that came later. First came the iron. By 1861, he had become a partner in a small iron firm, Bidwell and Phipps. The iron business in Pittsburgh in those years was a churning, merging, half-chaotic thing. Firms combining and splitting and combining again, and Phipps moved through it with the patience of a man who understood that the real game was not the furnaces. It was the money behind the furnaces. By the standards of the men around him, he was not loud and he was not visionary. He was reliable in a way that turned out to matter more than vision. I want to slow down on how unlikely the next part is, because it is easy to read these stories backward, as if the row house boy was always destined for the carved name in Baltimore. He was not. Nothing about a shoemaker's son leaving school at 14 promises a steel empire and a psychiatric clinic. What happened to Phipps happened because he was standing next to the right person, with the right skill, at the moment a country was about to build itself out of steel. Timing and proximity made him. He would have been the first to say so. And the person he was standing next to was the boy from 2 doors down, who by now was no longer an errand boy, but a young man with enormous ambition and a gift for selling. When Carnegie began assembling the pieces of what would become the largest steel operation in the world, he needed someone he trusted completely to handle the part he found tedious and Phipps found fascinating. He needed someone to mind the money. If you have made it this far, you should probably subscribe. It is free, and it is what keeps these coming. Chapter 3. The Money Getter. Andrew Carnegie had a name for Henry Phipps. He called him his money getter, and he meant it as the highest kind of compliment. The phrase is worth sitting with, because it describes a role that the history books tend to skip. Carnegie was the face of the empire, the philosopher of wealth, the man who wrote essays and gave away libraries and wanted, badly, to be admired. Henry Clay Frick, who came later, was the Iron Fist, the chairman who ran the mills and broke the strikes. But between the showman and the enforcer there was a third man, and his job was to make sure the money was always there. That was Phipps. He raised the credit, he soothed the bankers, he kept the books honest, and he held a famously difficult partnership together through years when the 3 principal men could barely stand to be in a room with one another. The firm came together in stages, the way these things did in an industry that was inventing itself year by year. In 1865, the various iron interests merged into a concern called Union Iron Mills, folding the Phipps and Carnegie operations into a single growing enterprise. There were other partners along the way, other names that rose and fell, and Phipps was often the man in the middle of the negotiation, the one who could find the figure that let 2 stubborn men shake hands. Over the next 2 decades, the partnership expanded, absorbed rivals, and adopted the new Bessemer method that turned iron into cheap steel at a scale the world had never seen. By 1886, it had been formally organized as Carnegie, Phipps and Company, and a few years after that, In 1892, it became the Carnegie Steel Company, capitalized at $25 million. The ownership of that company tells you exactly where Phipps stood. Carnegie held the largest share by far, the controlling interest in the whole enterprise. Phipps and Frick held smaller and roughly equal stakes, a distant second and third to the senior partner. Frick took the chairman's title and the public fights that came with it, and he was connected to the Phippses by marriage through the wider family, which only sharpened the tensions when they came. Carnegie took the public glory. Phipps took no title that anyone remembers and exercised a quieter kind of power, the power of the man who knows where every dollar is and is therefore in the room for every decision that matters. He was the ballast. In a partnership of large and colliding egos, he was the one who did not need to win the argument, only to keep the company whole. Carnegie could afford to be loud because Phipps was quiet. Frick could afford to be hard because Phipps was steady. The empire ran on a kind of division of temperament, and Phipps held the least glamorous and most necessary part of it. What the record keeps returning to about Phipps is simpler than ambition or genius. He did not want to be seen. Where Carnegie courted reporters and Frick courted confrontation, Phipps courted nothing. He gave almost no interviews. He kept his name out of the papers when he could. His own granddaughter, writing about him decades later, said plainly that he shunned all publicity about his personal life and his giving. And the phrase has the ring of family understatement about a man who was, by temperament, allergic to attention. I keep circling that reticence because it is the thing that makes this story so hard to tell and so worth telling. A man who hides on purpose leaves thin records. The triumphs get documented because triumphs are public. The private things, the family things, the failures and the illnesses and the early deaths slip into the gaps that a careful private man leaves everywhere behind him. Phipps built a fortune in the open and lived his life in the shade, and 3 generations later, when something terrible happened to one of his descendants, the shade was still there, swallowing the details. A loud family leaves a loud record. A private one leaves silences, and the silences are where the worst things tend to settle. This family was built, from the founder down, for silence. But that is ahead of us. In the 1890s, the partnership was thriving. The steel was pouring, and the 3 men who owned it were about to receive an offer that would make them, overnight, into a different order of rich. The offer would come from the most powerful banker in America, and it would be settled, famously, on a single slip of paper. Chapter 4. The Slip of Paper. The story goes that the largest business deal in American history to that point was sealed by a number written on a folded piece of paper, passed from one man to another, and accepted without a word of negotiation. By the end of the 1890s, Andrew Carnegie was tired. He was in his 60s. He had been building and fighting for 40 years, and he wanted to spend the rest of his life giving his money away rather than making more of it. On the other side stood John Pierpont Morgan, the banker who was then assembling the pieces of a single dominant American steel trust, and who understood that he could not build it without the largest steel company in the country. Carnegie Steel was the keystone. Morgan had to have it. So Morgan asked Carnegie to name his price. And Carnegie, according to the account that has come down to us, wrote a figure on a slip of paper and had it handed across. The figure was $480 million, though the sources vary, some putting the price nearer $400 million and a later Federal Review valuing the whole transaction higher still. Morgan looked at it and accepted it on the spot, and is said to have told Carnegie afterward that he had just made himself the richest man in the world. The exact number shifts with the telling, but the order of magnitude is not in dispute. It was the largest sum that had ever changed hands in an American business deal to that point. Out of that transaction, in 1901, came United States Steel, the first corporation in history capitalized at more than $1 billion, around $1.4 billion of it. a sum so large that contemporaries struggled to describe it. It controlled an enormous share of the nation's steelmaking at the very moment steel was the material the modern world was being built from. Bridges, rails, skyscrapers, ships. The country was about to pour itself into the 20th century, and one company would supply much of the metal. Carnegie's personal share ran to around $226 million, paid in gold bonds. And Henry Phipps, the money-getter, the boy from 2 doors down, took his portion as well. He had held about 11% of the company, second only to Carnegie himself, and his share of the sale came to somewhere between $40 and $50 million, paid in the same gold bonds. When reporters tried to get a reaction out of him about the windfall, he gave them, characteristically, almost nothing. The one line that survives is him marveling, briefly, at Carnegie. "Ain't Andy wonderful," he said. And that was about all. I want to set that number against another one, because the documentary cannot honestly stay inside the boardroom. 9 years before the sale, in 1892, the same company had broken its workers. At the steelworks in Homestead, Frick had answered the union's request for a raise with a demand for a wage cut, a reduction that would have fallen on roughly half the union's members. When the men resisted, the company locked them out, and Frick brought in hundreds of armed private guards, floated up the river on barges before dawn to hold the plant. What followed on the 6th of July, 1892, was not a metaphor for class conflict. It was an actual battle, fought with rifles along a riverbank, and it left men dead on both sides. The state militia eventually occupied the town. The Union held out for months, but it was beaten by the autumn. The workers who were taken back returned to 12-hour days at lower pay, and the Skilled Trades Union was effectively broken in American steel for a quarter of a century. The men who poured that steel were paid in coins. By the wage accounts that survive from the period, the skilled hands earned about $2.43 for a 12-hour shift, roughly 20 cents an hour, and the unskilled laborers earned closer to 14 cents an hour, something near $1.70 for the same 12-hour day. Set those wages next to the slip of paper. One signature, $480 million, and Phipps walking away with 40 or 50 million of it. By the standards of the men whose shifts built the company, that single transaction represented something like the combined working lifetimes of tens of thousands of them. And the detail that stays with me is this one. Those same workers, on their one free day, could walk through the glass conservatory that Phipps had given the city of Pittsburgh and admire the orchids. The benevolence was real. So was the arithmetic that made it possible. Both things are true, and a great deal of what follows in this family lives in the space between them. The question, in 1901, was what Phipps would do with a fortune of that size, now that the steel was sold and he no longer had a company to mind. The answer is the most admirable part of his life, and the part that sets up everything that went wrong. Hit subscribe if you want the next one. It costs nothing, and it takes a second. Chapter 5. The Quietest Fortune. The first thing to understand about how Henry Phipps gave his money away is that he tried, wherever he could, not to be thanked for it. This made him unusual, even among the great Gilded Age donors. Carnegie gave in order to be seen giving. He wrote a famous essay, The Gospel of Wealth, arguing that the rich had a duty to distribute their surplus in their own lifetimes, and he put his name on thousands of libraries so that the giving would be remembered. Phipps believed something close to the same duty. He simply did not want the credit. He gave steadily, deliberately, and as quietly as a man that wealthy could manage. He had begun even before the Great Windfall. In 1893, near the height of the steel years, he gave the city of Pittsburgh a conservatory, an enormous glass house full of palms and orchids and ferns, set in a public park, free for the working families of the city to walk through on a Sunday. It still stands. After the sale, the giving widened. In 1905, he put $1 million into building model tenements in New York. Decent, sanitary apartments for working people, run through an organization called Phipps Houses that exists to this day. He funded institutes for the study and treatment of tuberculosis, the disease that was then killing the poor of the industrial cities faster than almost anything else. The slow drowning of the lungs that crowded tenements bred and spread. He put institutes in Philadelphia and in Baltimore, and made a major gift to the University of Pennsylvania for the work. It was, in its way, of a piece with the psychiatric clinic. Phipps kept choosing the illnesses that the poor suffered and the rich preferred not to look at, the diseases of the lung and the diseases of the mind, and putting his money against them. And he and his family accumulated, as the very rich of that era did, a great deal of land. They built on Long Island, at Old Westbury, where his eldest son raised a great Charles II-style house that is now a public garden. They went south, to Florida, to Palm Beach, and there the scale becomes almost comic. At one point, the Phipps family owned something close to a third of the town of Palm Beach, along with miles of oceanfront and large tracts inland. They were not merely visitors to the American aristocracy. By the standards of the new century, they were its landlords. There were houses at Old Westbury and houses in Palm Beach, an estate on Cape Cod, property in New York, holdings in the West, until the family map of the country looked less like a set of homes than like a portfolio you could live inside. And to manage all of it, and to hold it together for the children and the children's children, Phipps had created, in 1907, a private family office. He called it the Bessemer Trust, after the process that had made the steel, that had made the money. It would outlast him by a century, and it is, quietly, one of the most important characters in this story. The children carried the name outward into the century in ways their private father never would have sought the attention for. One daughter, Amy, married a cousin of Winston Churchill and lived much of her life in England. And in 1928, she quietly put up the money for an aviation venture that would carry a young pilot named Amelia Earhart across the Atlantic, the first woman to make the crossing by air. The family was woven, by money and marriage, into the spine of the 20th century, and it managed to do most of it without ever quite stepping into the light. I keep coming back to the privacy, because it is not a small thing. It is, in a way, the family's deepest inheritance, deeper than the steel money. A dynasty engineered for discretion, a family that gave without signing its gifts, that married into power without courting the press, that built enormous houses and then drew the curtains. There is something admirable in it. There is also something that, much later, would function almost like a wall, keeping the worst of what happened to them out of view, even from the people trying, in good faith, to find out. The same instinct that kept the family off the front pages in life kept its tragedies off the page in death. Privacy, practiced long enough, becomes a kind of erasure of its own. Of all the gifts Henry Phipps made, the one that seems to have meant the most to him, and the one that matters most to this story, was the one that carried his name onto a hospital for the mind. To understand what he built, and why the irony of it runs so deep, you have to meet the doctor he hired to run it, and the strange new century of psychiatry that doctor was helping to open. Chapter 6. The First Clinic. The man Henry Phipps paid to build American psychiatry was a Swiss immigrant named Adolf Meyer, and he believed something that sounds obvious now and was close to radical then. He believed that a mental illness was not a moral failing or a fixed defect of character, but an event in a life, something that happened to a whole person over time, and that you could not understand it without understanding the person it happened to. In an age that still treated madness as shameful, as something a family hid and an institution swallowed, this was a quietly radical idea. It said the patient was a person first and a case second, and that the order mattered. The gift that built his clinic came together at the end of the first decade of the new century. Johns Hopkins was then remaking American medicine, insisting on laboratories and research and rigor where there had been apprenticeship and guesswork. Its dean of medicine, one of the most influential physicians in the country, went looking for a donor who would let the school do for the mind what it was already doing for the body. He found Phipps, a man who had spent his fortune again and again on exactly the illnesses polite society preferred to ignore, and who needed very little convincing. They found Phipps. The endowment was announced in 1908. By some accounts, the initial offer was a few $100,000, plus a yearly sum, and over the following years the giving grew, until the figure most often attached to the clinic is $1.5 million. An enormous commitment for the study of an illness most wealthy men preferred not to discuss. Phipps, true to himself, did not want a fuss made of it. He gave the money for the work, not for the recognition, and then receded, the way he always did. The university got its clinic. The country got its first real academic home for the study of the mind. Heir was installed as the head of the new department, and what he built there shaped the field for half a century. He called his approach psychobiology, an awkward word for a humane idea, which was that you treated the patient as a biological creature and a biographical one at the same time, the body and the life story together. To do it, he took an exhaustive personal history from each patient. Where they were born, how they were raised, what they had loved and lost, when the trouble had started, and what had been happening around them when it did. He wrote it all down in a structured way, and that document, the long, careful record of a human being, became known in the field as the Phipps history. It is worth being fair to what this was, because it is easy, from here, to be cynical about a Steele family buying a hospital. This was not vanity philanthropy. The method that came out of that building genuinely changed how American doctors treated the mentally ill. It said that a person in crisis was a person with a story that mattered medically, and not simply a body to be confined. Doctors trained under Heir carried that idea across the country, into other hospitals and other universities, until a generation of American psychiatry had been shaped in that one Baltimore building. He stayed at its head for decades. For a long stretch of the 20th century, much of what was decent and humane in American psychiatry could trace a line back to the clinic with the Phipps name over the door. The asylum had warehoused people. The clinic proposed to know them. That was the whole of the difference, and it was an enormous difference. To be admitted to the old asylum was, very often, to disappear. To be admitted to the Phipps clinic was, at least in principle, to be seen, to have your life taken seriously enough to be written down. A Steele fortune had paid for that shift in how a country regarded its most fragile people. By the standards of its moment, it was about as enlightened a thing as medicine could do. Listen to the patient, write down the life, treat the mind as something worth understanding rather than something to be managed out of sight. But the century that clinic helped open did not stay enlightened. Psychiatry in the decades that followed went looking for faster answers than the slow work of listening, and some of those answers were brutal. The same field that produced the patient and his careful history also produced the operating table and the instrument that went in above the eye. And the family that had paid to build the listening room would, in the end, have a son who needed the whole century of treatment, the good and the terrible both, and who got something from it that no one in the family ever fully explained. Subscribing is how stories like this keep reaching you, and it stays free. Chapter 7. The Ice Pick. In the autumn of 1936, in a hospital in Washington, a doctor named Walter Freeman directed a colleague, the surgeon James Watts, through the first prefrontal lobotomy performed in the United States. The patient was a 63-year-old woman who suffered from anxiety and sleeplessness. The operation cut the connections in the front of her brain. She grew calmer. Freeman called it a success, and a new era in American psychiatry began. The era it began lasted barely 20 years, but in that time, it touched an astonishing number of lives, and it was praised, at its height, as one of the great advances of modern medicine. Its inventor abroad was given a Nobel Prize for it. It is worth being precise about what a lobotomy actually was, because the word has become a kind of shorthand, and the reality was specific and grim. The procedure severed the pathways between the frontal lobes and the rest of the brain. It did, often, make agitated patients quiet. It also, often, left them flattened, blunted, childlike, robbed of the very things that made them themselves. It was sold as a cure. In a great many cases, it was closer to an erasure, a trading of a difficult person for a manageable one, a quieting that the patient never agreed to and could not undo. Families were told it would help. Doctors believed, many of them sincerely, that it did. The harm was often invisible until it was permanent. Freeman became its evangelist, and evangelist is the right word, because he pursued the procedure with the zeal of a man spreading good news. Within a decade, he had developed a faster version that needed no surgeon and no operating room, performed with a slender instrument that resembled an ice pick, taken from his own kitchen drawer in the earliest version of the story, and driven in above the eye. It took minutes. He could do several in a day. He needed no hospital to do it. He drove across the country demonstrating it, and the speed and simplicity of it meant it could be done almost anywhere, on almost anyone, including the people least able to refuse. By the time the era burned out in the 1950s, with the arrival of the first drugs that could quiet a patient without a blade, tens of thousands of Americans had been lobotomized. At a single state hospital on Long Island, roughly 2,000 of the operations were performed. By one count, something like 1 in every 25 lobotomies in the entire country, done in one set of overcrowded wards. The procedure spread fastest exactly where oversight was thinnest. State hospitals were chronically overcrowded and chronically broke, and a fast operation that turned a violent or unmanageable patient into a quiet one was, to an administrator counting beds and staff, a kind of relief. The people on the receiving end of that relief were rarely asked what they wanted. Here is the part that matters for this family, and the contrast the whole era turns on. The people who filled those state hospital wards were overwhelmingly poor and disproportionately women, committed by relatives or by the state, operated on with little real consent in institutions that were overcrowded and underfunded, and desperate for anything that would make a difficult patient manageable. Lobotomy was, among other things, a procedure performed on people who could not say no. And the wealthy were not exempt from the era. They simply met it differently. They met it in private clinics and private rooms, with the most respected names in medicine, paying for the most modern treatment available. The most famous case is one almost everyone now knows. In 1941, the daughter of one of the richest and most powerful families in America was lobotomized by Freeman and Watts to manage moods and behavior the family found difficult. Rosemary Kennedy went into that operation, a young woman who could read and write and keep a diary, sociable and present in the life of a large and ambitious family. She came out unable to speak more than a few words or care for herself, permanently incapacitated, and her family placed her in an institution in the Midwest and kept her almost entirely out of public view for the rest of her long life. For years afterward, the public was told only that she was shy or that she taught school somewhere quiet. The truth stayed inside the family for decades. The Kennedy case belongs here not because it tells us what happened to any Phipps. It does not, and that distinction has to be held carefully. It belongs here because it shows the shape of a particular kind of tragedy. A wealthy family with a child who did not fit, a drastic medical answer bought at the highest level, and then a silence that closed over the whole thing and held for decades. Money did not buy those families an escape from the era. It bought them the same dangerous medicine, in nicer rooms, with better-known doctors, and far more effective privacy afterward. That is the world the fourth generation of the Phipps family came of age in. The clinic with their name on it had helped open the century of psychiatry, and the century had grown a dark wing the founders never imagined. And somewhere inside that world was a great-grandson of Henry Phipps, a young man with every advantage the name could buy, and a trouble that none of it could fix. Chapter 8. Harry. His widow, many years later, described him in a single devastating phrase. She called him a tortured soul. His name was Henry Ogden Phipps, and the people who knew him called him Harry. He was born in 1931, a great-grandson of the man whose name was carved over the clinic door. His father was Ogden Phipps, and Ogden was the very picture of what the fortune was supposed to produce. A champion at court tennis, that rarefied old game played by almost no one outside the richest clubs in the world. A chairman of the Jockey Club and a force in American thoroughbred racing, part of a family that bred some of the greatest horses of the century, a steward of the fortune through the Bessemer companies. He wore inherited wealth like a well-cut coat, and he expected his sons to wear it the same way. Harry was raised at the top of American society, with the houses and the horses, the boarding schools and the kind of university education a young man of his name was simply expected to have. In 1957, he married a Czech countess, Diana Sternberg, the daughter of an old Central European noble family that had lost most of its world to the war and the communists. It was a wedding that joined old American money to old European title, the kind of match the society pages were built to admire, held far from home and attended by the sort of people whose names meant something on two continents. On paper, it was a charmed life. By the standards of almost anyone alive, he had been given everything a person could be given. The houses, the income, the education, the marriage, the name that opened every door in New York and most of the doors in Europe. There was no obstacle in front of him that money had not already cleared. And yet the thing that was wrong with him was not an obstacle money could clear. Whatever drove him toward the needle and away from the life he had been handed did not respond to a trust fund. It is one of the oldest lessons there is, and the rich relearn it in every generation, that there are kinds of suffering a fortune simply cannot reach. But something in him did not hold. The young man who moved through that gilded world also moved, by his late 20s, through a very different one. He fell into the orbit of the writer William Burroughs and the drug-using circle around him, the underworld of the early beat scene in New York and in Paris. And he shared their appetites for the hard end of it. The accounts that survive are not many, and they have to be handled with care, because a man like this leaves more rumor than record. His widow's later words and the recollections of people who moved through that circle describe a man pulled steadily downward by addiction, a Phipps heir adrift in a world about as far from court tennis and the Jockey Club as it was possible to get. He had the name, the trust income, the entire apparatus of the family behind him, and none of it reached him where he had gone. This was the cruelty of it, and the irony the whole story has been building toward. The family fortune could buy almost anything. It had bought conservatories and tenements and an entire department of psychiatry. It could not buy back a young man who had decided, for reasons no document explains, to come apart. The distance between those two worlds is where the whole tragedy lives. Here was a man who had access to the best private medicine in the country, whose family had literally built the institution that taught America to take a troubled mind seriously, and the best that all of it could do was not enough to keep him. Every door that money could open was open to him. He went out a different one. In April of 1962, Henry Ogden Phipps was found dead in a Manhattan hotel. He was 30 years old. The death was investigated by the city medical examiner, and the contemporary reporting treated it as a narcotics overdose. The newspapers ran short notices. A Phipps heir dead young in a hotel. the family declining to say much, the privacy that the founder had built 2 generations earlier, holding even at the death of a 30-year-old in a rented room. There was no long obituary, no public reckoning, no account of how a young man with everything had ended this way. There was a name, a date, and a closed door. He had been married 5 years. He left almost nothing behind in the public record, beyond the fact of how he died. And even that, as it turns out, is not entirely settled. Because there is a second story about Harry Phipps, one that does not appear in the newspapers or the obituaries, one that lives in family memory and in the pages of a book that is very hard to read. And it is the part of the story no one in the family would ever quite explain. If you have made it this deep into the story, you are exactly who these are made for. Subscribe, and they keep coming. Chapter 9. The Thing That Cannot Be Confirmed. The claim is this, that at some point before his death, Henry Ogden Phipps, great-grandson of the man who built the first psychiatric clinic in America, was lobotomized. Not once, but twice. It is a stunning thing to be told about this family, given the clinic, given the name over the door, given everything. What the search for it turned up is more complicated and more uncomfortable than a simple yes or no. I could not confirm it. The search was not casual. It ran through the genealogical records, the obituaries, the contemporary newspaper coverage of his death, the histories of the family, and the histories of the clinic, the scholarship on the beat circle he moved in, and the accounts left by the people who knew him. In none of those accessible sources is there a documented statement that Henry Ogden Phipps, or any Phipps heir, underwent a lobotomy, let alone 2. The records that describe his end describe drugs and a hotel room, not an operating table. If a man of his name had twice been subjected to brain surgery, one might expect some trace of it somewhere, in a hospital record that surfaced, in a biography of the circle he ran in the long memory of a family that documents everything else. There is no such trace in anything a reader can reach. That absence does not prove the claim false. Absence of a record is not the same as proof that nothing happened, especially in a family this practiced at keeping things off the record. It only means the claim stands on testimony, not on paper, and that the testimony lives in a place almost no one can get to. A story told inside a family, written once in a book few will ever read, is a fragile kind of history. It is not nothing. It is also not proof. If the lobotomy story lives anywhere on a page at all, the likeliest place is a single memoir. Diana Sternberg's mother, the Countess Cecilia Sternberg, wrote a book about her life called The Journey, published in the 1970s. It covers the years of her daughter's marriage to Harry. It is long, nearly 600 pages, and it is out of print, and it survives mostly as a borrow-restricted scan that cannot be searched. So the relevant pages, the ones covering the years of the marriage and Harry's decline, cannot easily be checked against the claim without reading the book itself end to end. The story may well be in there, told by a woman who was close to the marriage and watched it come apart. It may also be family knowledge that was spoken but never reached a verifiable page at all, the kind of thing a family says about its own and never writes down. What can be said is that the claim appears to trace back to private family testimony, and not to any medical record or news account that the search could reach. There is one more uncertainty worth being honest about. Even the cause of death is not perfectly settled. The contemporary investigation treated it as a narcotics overdose. At least one later source frames it instead as a suicide. Those cannot be reconciled, and there is no point pretending the record is cleaner than it is. One account says the drugs killed him by accident. Another says he meant them to. The family, characteristically, said almost nothing either way. A young man died, in a hotel, at 30, of something involving drugs. Beyond that, the certainty thins out fast, and the people who could have made it certain are gone. This is an honest and unsatisfying place to be left, and it is more useful to sit in it than to pave over it. The most provocative single fact in this entire story: the two lobotomies, the thing that would make the irony perfect and complete, is the one fact that cannot be confirmed. It may be true. The family built the clinic, and a son of the family may have ended up under exactly the kind of procedure that the clinic's own century produced. That would be the darkest possible closing of the circle. But I will not tell you it happened as though it were settled, because I cannot, and there is a real person at the center of it who is not here to correct the record. What can be stated with confidence is everything around it, and it is damning enough on its own. A great-grandson of the founder died young and ruined. The family that taught a nation to keep careful histories of the suffering kept none that can settle the most important question about its own. And that absence, that silence where the record should be, is the truest thing the story has to offer. Chapter 10. What the Record Keeps. The name is still carved over the door in Baltimore. The clinic is still open. More than a century after it took in its first patient, doctors at Johns Hopkins are still trained in a version of the method that carries the family name, still taught to take down the long, careful history of the person in front of them before they reach for anything else. The money is still there too, held the way the founder designed it to be held. The Bessemer Trust that Harry Phipps created in 1907 to guard the fortune for his descendants did exactly that. It grew, through more than a century of careful management, into one of the largest private wealth managers in the country. By the firm's own account, it now oversees more than $200 billion, and even the more conservative outside estimates put it near $100 billion. The steel money did not just survive, it compounded quietly, generation after generation, exactly as a private man building for private heirs would have wanted. The fortune outlived the steel, outlived the founder, outlived the children and the grandchildren, and it is still here, working, mostly invisible, doing the one thing it was built to do, which is to last. It is worth pausing on a small and misleading number here. When Harry Phipps died in 1930, the estate that passed through probate was appraised at only about $3 million, a figure so small against the fortune that it looks like a misprint. It was not. It was the design. The bulk of the wealth had already been moved, during his lifetime, into trusts and gifts, and the Bessemer structure, years before he died, out of reach of the probate court and the estate tax and the newspapers that tallied such things. He had given his sons millions in real estate while he lived. He had built the trust to hold the rest. The small public number at the end was not a loss of fortune. It was the fortune, working exactly as intended, disappearing from public view at the precise moment the public would have looked. Even in death, the family stayed off the page. So here is what the record keeps. It keeps the name in the stone. It keeps the method in the textbooks. It keeps the fortune in the trust. What it does not keep, what it never quite kept, is the son. Let me step back, because the chronology is finished. It would be easy to make this a tidy lesson. To say that money cannot buy happiness, or that psychiatry failed the very family that built it, or that the Phipps line was somehow cursed. None of that belongs here, because each of those is a way of closing the story off before you have actually looked at it. There was no curse. There was a fortune built for privacy, a century of medicine that promised more than it could deliver, and a young man who fell through every net that money and science could string beneath him. What strikes me, after the time I have spent with this family, is the shape of the silence. A family that paid to teach America how to write down a suffering person's story left almost no story of its own most suffering son. The founder built an entire institution around the conviction that the troubled mind deserved a careful record. 3 generations later, when the troubled mind was his own great-grandson, there was no careful record. There was a hotel room, a short notice in the paper, a claim in a memoir no one can check, and a silence the family had been perfecting for 100 years. What survived is the public half of the family. The name over the door survived. The method survived. The conservatory and the gardens and the trust survived, and the $200 billion survived. What did not survive is the private half. A great-grandson did not survive his 30s. The truth about how he was treated did not survive into any record anyone can read. The certainty the founder believed every patient deserved did not survive for the one patient who shared his name. The clinic could give a stranger a careful history. It could not give one to the founder's own great-grandson, and no one in the family ever wrote the history that would have told us what really happened to him. Go back, one last time, to the building in Baltimore on that spring morning in 1913. The new clinic, the first of its kind in the country. The single word carved into the stone above the entrance. A family name. A promise that the troubled mind would be studied and steadied and written down with care. The promise is still carved there. It has not weathered much in 100 years. It still means, to every patient who passes under it, exactly what it was meant to mean. The name is still carved over the door in Baltimore, and the clinic still teaches doctors how to listen. What it could not do for one of its own is not carved anywhere. This is what these are for. Subscribe, and I will see you on the next one.